As drafted, this bill would establish a public election fund to provide public campaign financing for a candidate for a county elective office, regulate campaign finance activity of a candidate for county elective office who voluntarily accepts public campaign financing, authorize the Maryland State Board of Elections to administer and enforce the public campaign financing system, and provide for penalties for violations of the public campaign financing system. And so, as I said, this is going to be, I think, a real important topic. It's a very important bill. I want to obviously thank Councilmember Phil Andrews for his leadership in introducing this. What I expect is that we will have a robust conversation today. I'm sure that there will be I think at least one more session that we would want to have, depending on how things go, so that we can answer all the questions and understand very well what it is that we are doing and adopting here. I would also say that I believe we have somebody from finance with us today, not Mr. Beach, though. But he didn't make it, that's fine. And Mr. Demarinis is here as well from the Division of Candidacy and Campaign Finance for the State Board of Elections. Welcome, Mr. Really appreciate you coming over to Montgomery County to be with us this afternoon. And so I will turn it over to Mr. Drummer and Mr. Hamlin, whoever wants to start us off as we begin to go through the packet. I think it's an extraordinary packet, and I really like the way that it's organized in terms of topics. I think we'll start obviously with the overview of the legislation, and then we'll go through each point and see where we end up. And I want to ask my colleagues, both in the committee and my colleagues who are not in the committee, to feel free to stop at any time, ask questions. Again, I think that this will be a time for us, if we have further information, et cetera, it's a time for us to request that so that we can expeditiously then have another opportunity to come back and discuss those questions. So let's see, Mr. Drummer.
Thank you. This bill actually, in the 2013 session of the General Assembly, enacted a Campaign Finance Reform Act, and one small provision in that act authorized counties to adopt a public campaign financing law for county elective offices, meaning the county executive and county council offices. And that's what this bill would do. It would implement that law. The state law requires that the county law or the county system, I guess, be regulated by the State Board of Elections, and that's why Mr. Demarinis is here, and he has had an opportunity to review the bill as well, and can certainly answer any questions and may have some issues he'd like to bring up as well. The bill establishes a matching fund system, which would require a candidate who wants public campaign funding for either the primary or the general election to solicit and I guess more than solicit, to receive qualifying contributions from county residents of no more than $150. The point is to require somebody to show support for a specific number of county residents through their pocketbook, a large number of small donations, essentially. As the state law permits, although normally we don't have any authority to regulate campaign finance for candidates, it's done totally at the state level, we do have authority to regulate the campaign finance procedures for someone who voluntarily asks for public funding under this bill, and that's what this bill would do. So it would limit somebody to accepting donations only from individuals and for no more than $150. The match is designed to require or to encourage somebody to get a large number of smaller donations. You get more money for the first $50 of each donation. Then you get for a county executive, for instance, you get it's a 6-to-1 match for the first $50, and you get a 4-to-1 match for the second $50 and a 2-to-1 match for the third $50. And council offices has a similar tiered system like that. There's a maximum amount of money in the bill that somebody can collect through public funding, and it's in the bill here. Well, first of all, I should say you need, in order to be certified for public funding as a candidate for county executive, you need at least 500 qualifying contributions. And there's a qualifying period which begins 365 days before the date of the primary for the election. And you have to get 500 qualifying contributions, plus it has to be an aggregate total of at least $40,000. For an at-large council member, it would be 250 qualifying contributions and an aggregate total of $20,000. And a candidate for district council member must collect at least 125 qualifying contributions and at least an aggregate total of $10,000. If you hit those limits, and you then would be certified for public financing, and then the match, you'd get matching money based on the number of qualifying contributions you had in the manner that I already described. Yes?
Yes, absolutely.
One thing I may not have understood this previously. So, is there an absolute limit on the amount that you can raise in those small contributions?
No, there's an absolute limit on the amount of qualifying matching contributions you're going to get. You can continue to raise as many small contributions as you want, even if you've maxed out on your public contribution.
Yeah, Councilmember Andrews, which I should have given you an opportunity at
it's
the
okay.
beginning to talk
Yeah.
about your bill.
And
Go
the
ahead.
thinking on that, in not having a limit on the number of small individual contributions that a candidate can raise, is that we want to encourage participation by the public and encourage candidates to go and find small individual contributors. And so there's not a limit on what you can accept in terms of small individual contributions. There's a limit on how many of them will be matched.
Right.
And those limits are $125,000 for a district race, $250,000 in public funds, up to $250,000 for an at-large race, and up to $750,000 in a county executive race. So the idea of the public funding is to get you to a point where you have sufficient funds to run a credible campaign, but not to have an unlimited amount of public funding that you can access. But we don't limit what you can continue to raise small individual contributions from anybody of up to $150 and beyond what might be eligible for a match.
And if you could, then I'll go back to the packet, but how much do you have to raise in order to qualify for the full match amount?
Okay. Well, which race are you talking about?
If you could just list
All right,
each of them.
The answer is that if you are running for, let's say, county council at large.
Yeah.
That's
I might be
important
doing
race.
that.
Let's say you're running county council at large. All right, and I know there are some others who might be running in a district race. But let's take at large. So
Possibility of that, too.
the most you can receive in public funds under this proposal is $250,000. To qualify to receive that full amount, if you are raising it entirely from contributions of $50, then you're looking at needing to get, a $50 contribution under this proposal becomes a $250 total, because the $50 is matched at 4-to-1. So every 50 becomes $250. So 1,000 $50 contributions would enable you, actually that's 200, and so, all right, 1,250 contributions of $50 would enable you to get a $250,000 public match.
And then your total budget under that, if you were to proceed under that approach, your total budget would be 50 times 1,250 plus 250, which is
Right. You would have approximately, right, 1,250 times 50, about $315,000.
okay.
Roughly, would be your budget that you would have. But then, if you are still free That's what gets you up to the 250 match.
and then you can
under
keep
the
raising from
broadest
there.
scenario. Now, you could get there also by raising contributions of $100. And the first 50 is matched at 4-1, the second 50 is matched at 3-1. So
If you were to raise all of your
fourth, 3 and
contributions,
2. So the second 50 is matched at 3-1, and the third 50 is matched at 2-1.
so if you were to raise all of your contributions from $100, you would actually have more in the end than a candidate who raised all of her contributions from $50, but, you would have to generate a lot more contributions of $100, which is harder, but, okay.
Well, you would not need to raise quite as many contributions if you get some $100 contributions in there. Because the $100 contribution, the first 50 is matched at 4-1, the second at 3-1. So a $100 contribution becomes a $350 match. Okay? So a $100 contribution produces a net of $450. We can do it. We can
Could we
lay
do
this
a
out on
little
the
Excel sheet? Is that
Could.
possible? I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
simple math. It would just be helpful.
Yes.
I
This is
mean,
our
this
first,
is very
our
serious
first request.
business.
Right.
Our number first
Uh,
request.
So,
just-
yeah.
I
So
just,
that we can
Excel
show various
spreadsheet.
scenarios and how you do it. But the idea is that in order to get a substantial amount of public funding, you've got to raise a substantial number of small individual contributions. But there's a limit on how much public funding you can eventually access. It's up at that limit that's in the bill right now. However, there's no limit on your ability to continue to involve people and to have them give you small individual contributions. And
Up to $150.
up to $150, right. So that's the idea of the bill. And so the bill does not have an overall spending limit because it doesn't seem like you need one as long as the source of the funds are small individual contributions.
Councilmember Branson, you have your light on? That's okay.
And the contributions under $50 don't count? Do they aggregate?
They aggregate. It's the first 50. Any dollar up to the first 50 from 5. We set it at 5. The qualifying contribution was 5 to 150. So, yes, the first $50, if someone gives you a $10 contribution, that's matched at 4-1.
Okay.
Any of the first $50 are matched at that amount.
Council President Rice had something.
Sorry. So we kind of jumped into the, full feet. And let me say, Jared, it's always good to see you. Jared and I worked together when I was on the other side.
I have to say, I'm
That.
so amazed to put a face to the name Jared Damaris. I mean, I've seen that name
yeah.
for years.
Yeah.
I apologize, I usually would wear a suit, but I thought this was just a working session.
It's quite all right. You're dressed very appropriately for
That's fine.
that.
Jared, so it's good to see you as always. One of the questions that I have had, and since we're getting into some of the matching and how much can be raised, limitations, correct me if I'm wrong, is there nothing that prohibits someone from spending money on your campaign on your behalf? And is there a limitation to that? So for
outside groups, you mean?
exactly. So for example, if I'm participating in this, but XYZ community group says that they want to support and raise money to help elect Craig Rice, and they want to, operating under the same legal requirements that are there within the State Board of Elections, how do these two things dovetail together?
Well, there is no spending limitations for outside groups coming in on your elections. And depending on how they actually are formed, there could be no contribution limits on how they raise their monies as well. So, for example, if you have what is commonly known as a super PAC, which is an independent expenditure-only political committee. So they would be registered with the State Board of Elections, stating that they would only make independent expenditures. They would be able to raise money of an unlimited nature, so they don't even have to go with our contribution limits of $4,000 and $6,000 from PACs. They could take hundreds of thousands of dollars. Oh, sorry. Okay. So if they're that type of entity, now if they're just a regular entity that's doing a person making an independent expenditure, i.e. A business, they can spend their own general treasury dollars on those funds of an unlimited nature on you. A regular political committee would also be able to make an independent expenditure, but if they are making transfers and other activities, that they might be limited on how much money they receive. But there's no limits on how much they can spend against a candidate.
And the reason why I wanted to ask this question is because I want to try and understand, and this has always been my concern when we've worked on these bills in Annapolis. You could have a situation where a person is taking public campaign finance money, talking about limitations on campaign spending, but still outspend inordinately anybody else and have tons of outside money pouring into the campaign. And that is a true concern of mine, which addresses other issues that are on the federal level.
Right.
But I just wanted to make sure that I understood.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Question on this topic.
Councilmember Ramirez, go ahead.
Well, so would we be allowed in any way to tie the public system to outside? I mean, there's no way, you're not legally allowed to prevent any outside organization from
That is right.
conducting a campaign activity.
Right.
No.
Yeah, that's right. And the Supreme Court has said you can't, there's no, the state can't do that either.
Right, there's no, anybody can make an independent expenditure that's, First Amendment right into the political arena.
It's that pesky First Amendment.
It just always gets in the way.
I mean, I guess the
Well,
way.
but we are sort of getting, I mean, we're not getting around it, we're establishing a system with rules that's internal to that system, but we can't condition anything else upon it.
I think the one way that this bill addresses those concerns is by not having expenditure limits. In the past, public financing bills were always with the idea of an expenditure limit, saying, well, this candidate is not going to spend more than X amount of dollars, which is what we're dealing with on the gubernatorial level. This bill doesn't cap it. All it does is cap how much money you can receive publicly. So in a sense that if a person came against you and you've already received the $250,000 as an at-large council member, there's no restrictions on you still receiving $150 checks. The only thing that it would be prohibited would be the matching aspect
Would
of
you
it.
be prohibited from soliciting towards an outside effort? I mean,
In fact, that's an amendment we're looking at. It's an amendment that's going to be considered today, is to
Okay.
say that a candidate who's participating cannot subvert the system by going out and soliciting contributions for funds that could be used to help them.
a parallel committee.
Yes, right. So that we can address under this, because we can condition the participation and say, if you're going to participate in the system, if you're going to set public funds, here are the rules. And
Well,
we
that's
can-
what I was trying to get at. So you can establish that you're not eligible for public funds if you were to solicit for any contributions towards any other type of campaign committee, but you couldn't say you're not eligible for public funds if anyone does anything else on your behalf.
Right, you can't, yeah.
That's not,
That's beyond the
Beyond
scope, and beyond the scope of the law
Right.
itself, according to the Supreme Court.
Yes, exactly. As long as there's no cooperation or coordination
is that,
between.
is that the dividing line? Could you could define it as coordination. If you are not allowed to accept, you will not be allowed to participate in the matching fund if you coordinate with any outside organization?
I would say that that's pretty much the magic words on this, is
Yeah.
the coordination level. Because if you're cooperating and coordinating with it, that loses their independence between you and the candidate. And
But those would
Therefore,
not,
yeah.
currently, the law actually, I think, the independent limits on independent expenditures, or the law that allows independent expenditures, usually presumes that there's no coordination, otherwise they're not independent. So once they're coordinated, they're no longer independent, and they're subject to limits. So that's the way that independent expenditures work. But we could prohibit a candidate participating in the system from going out and soliciting funds for independent expenditures. Or parallel, or other committees, right.
Yeah.
Say, you can only raise funds, and we actually, yes, we can make very clear that you can only raise funds for this committee that you have established under the public funding law.
Because is there anything in the law preventing more than one committee existing that is designed to elect a candidate? Could I have friends of Hans Remer and other friends of Hans Remer?
Funny you mention
Future
that.
friends?
Because honestly, the funny part about this is that we're on a 4-year election cycle. This public financing will only be basically allowed for, from what I gather, which is the qualifying period, which is 1 year before the primary election. So you will have a candidate committee that is your current candidate committee for the other 3 years of the election
That's another
cycle.
issue, which I've also
Right.
noticed, and I wanted to ask about that as well. You know, you could raise and spend in those first 3 years in the traditional system, and then file your notice to participate in the public system, and just stop raising and spending in your
Right,
existing account.
Yes, which was, I had that as one of my questions of how you wanted to address that on that 3-year period. So yes, I mean, right now you could have multiple accounts. You currently have multiple accounts.
You can right today, in existing law, you could have, I have friends of Hans Remer. That's
Right,
it.
you have-
There could be other friends of Hans Remer,
Right.
and money could be raised and spent by that committee as well?
If you authorize that, yes.
And it doesn't, is there any coordination rule with that or anything?
Well, if you've authorized it, then you've coordinated. A perfect example is slates. So, you know, slates are, you're a member of a slate. So if I gave Friends of Hans Remer $4,000, I can't give to any of your slates any additional money unless I tell the slate, you can't spend this money on Hans Remer because I've already maxed out the $4,000 to your campaign account.
It gets complicated pretty quick.
Oh, yes, it does. So the one thing about this is that with the period here is that you have it for a 1-year period. So before that, you have the 3-year period. What we've done on the state level was we made all those accounts that qualified for public financing in a dormant state, where we said at this point, all your monies before that will not be eligible for matching funds or will not be, and you can't spend it. So we've sort of suspended it, put it in an escrow account, and then chose a date forward and started to match against it. So you sort of have that with a qualifying period here, and which I think lessens the blow of the original part about if they want to have speech elements here, because it's only restricted during the time in which they're accepting public financing for a 1-year period or a little bit beyond that. So it's not an absolute prohibition on a person that accepts public financing on whether or not they can go out and solicit to outside groups. It's a finite period that you've defined, which I think, because it's a voluntary program and it's a defined period, that it would maintain constitutional muster.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm totally following all the slate stuff. I'm going to have to do a little more.
Well, the
research.
slates are a different
Well,
thing.
Yeah.
All right, let me move over to Councilmember Rice has a question, and Councilmember Branson, Council President, and then you're fine? Okay, Councilmember President. And then I think this is really good. No, this is good, because this is the first time that we're tackling, you know, the bill and the ideas for us to have a work session, which is
Right.
why you became
Right,
dressed.
exactly.
Yes.
And then, but then obviously it's, you know, we do need to go into what's in the packet slowly. As questions come up, we'll address those. But, so, okay, you're going to have a follow-up,
Just want to make a quick
follow-up?
comment, yeah. And that is that election law is inherently complicated.
Yes.
It is. And the purpose of this bill and this ability of us to address election law is very limited under this provision that was passed by the state. And I want to recognize Common Cause Maryland did a lot of work to get that through, and Jennifer Bevan-Dangle is here today as the executive director, that all we have the authority to do under that law is to establish a public financing system. And the purpose of that is to give candidates an alternative way to run for office to the traditional way. We're not able to solve the problems that are inherent or are existing in the current system, but we can provide an alternative approach that gives candidates a very different way to run for office and will enable and provide strong incentives for individuals to contribute, small individuals' contributions, and expand the field of candidates most likely as well. I would love to be able to address some of these larger issues like the independent expenditures, but it's totally beyond our ability to do so here, and it's actually beyond the ability of the state on some of that stuff, too.
Okay, Council President Rice.
Just very, very quickly, with regards to the collaboration piece or the, I can't help but, we have current question going on in DC Council right now about shadow campaigns. And so, when you say collaboration, I mean, does that mean that I am, you now have a letter that's before you that was drafted by Craig Rice saying, I want you to establish another campaign, or is it the connection of, Craig Rice being on the authorizing as a part of as a listed candidate, or is it just that we assume that, I mean, I'm really trying to get to what that means, because I think that that's important, because in saying that, well, that person's collaborating, it's not just an easy broad brush to say, oh yeah, well, they're collaborating and so therefore they're not eligible. Because my number one concern about this, and the thing I don't want, and I share the same thing, the same passion that Councilmember Andrews does, what I don't want is somebody to be able to use this system to take taxpayer money when they already have means with which to raise money, and we've just bumped them up by another $250,000. And that's what my concern is that, and that's what we talked about in the example that Councilmember Reamer brought up, which is my concern, because a self-funder, for example, who decides that they're going to go in, but then say, okay, my wife, has lots of money and she's going to start a campaign, and I'm not talking to my wife about whether or not she's going to support me or not, but she does because she loves me and she wants to support me and set up a campaign finance account. I mean, how do we establish that connectivity? So,
that's pretty much the huge elephant in the room, and this is what states are grappling with currently. I guess the only way would be is to allow us enough latitude so that you don't need, say, a specific email or some sort of written document for the penalty phases of it. I don't think that you should, I guess, set up the nice framework for it, but then have almost more draconian penalties if you violate it, where people would almost be fearful of going close to the line because of the penalties aspect of, not just repaying all the public financing, but then having some sort of, civil penalty that's associated with it, along the lines of, say, the civil penalty that it includes the same amount of money that you took on public financing, so that it's a severe amount. And to allow us, I guess that's more of a prosecution element as well, to establish the mens rea on that front there, between if there was a meeting of the minds of a scheme to evade. And we can say that, on the penalties, something that if there's, coordination or cooperation between a candidate and a person who's trying to develop a scheme to evade or to circumvent these restrictions, that the candidate has to forfeit all of the public financing money, is personally liable for a civil penalty that includes the amount of money that was funneled illegally plus the amount of the public contribution along those lines there, so that you can go and say, well, do I even want to go close to that line, because I'm looking at a $1 million penalty, and not just the candidate but also the other person on the scheme. So,
thank you.
no problem.
Okay, so Mr. Drummer, let's go back to the packet.
Just briefly, just going back to that one point, the point about raising money the first 3 years, which, because this bill does not stop you from raising money in the traditional manner for the first 3 years before you follow your intent. But the bill does prevent you from using that money during the campaign. Once you've applied for public funding, you can no longer use the money you may have collected in the past. Now, could you use it 2 years before the election? Yes, you can, and still apply for public funding. I'm not sure, this bill doesn't do anything about that, but that is a bit early for the campaign. So,
So on that question,
Councilmember Reamer.
I mean, was that a decision, that you made, that we wouldn't want to have a system where you may not have any contributions to any campaign committee during an election cycle? Or how did you make that decision?
The idea was, how long is the qualifying period going to be for the public financing system? And a year seemed to be an adequate amount of time before the primary for there to be.
And you can't prevent anyone from having a committee in the
Yeah,
other times.
That's right. And no one has to participate. You can't force people to participate in a public financing system. And someone might start out thinking they want to try to participate in the public financing system. They may decide as they're going along, before they get any public funds reimbursed, that they want to stay in the old system. And so you can't make it mandatory that people participate in this. You have to attract them to do so.
And if you were to say the qualifying period is 2 years, then, well, that's just a really long qualifying
Seemed too
period to
long.
raise that
Yeah.
money.
A year seemed long enough. A year before the primary seemed to be a reasonable period of time for someone to have the adequate time to raise the qualifying contributions necessary to qualify. 2 years, we didn't want to. I don't think you want to encourage endless, campaigning. So, a year before the primary seemed like a reasonable period of time to have it as the beginning period for this process.
Plus, even if you had a 2-year qualifying period, somebody could wait to apply till a year before the primary and then still collect money in a traditional sense for that previous year. You're not going to stop it if somebody really wants to do that.
But it does, as was noted, once you accept public funds, you can't spend money from any other campaign committee that may be under your control.
Okay. Councilmember Branson.
Now I'm confused. Okay, so once you accept public funds, you can't spend money from any other campaign fund under your control, but you can continue to raise money
But only for
outside of the.
No, but only for
public-
that one fund. Once you decide you're going to win the public funding system, you take the money, take the public funding money, that's the only fund that you can spend or raise money for.
And actually, once you file your notice of intent to get public funding, you can't get a qualifying contribution until you file your notice of intent and set up your separate campaign account just for public funding. So,
It has to be completely
so,
separate.
and
from
once you do that, you can no longer take more than $150 in contributions or a contribution from a corporation or another organization.
So
So
it's
we're-
isolated in that way.
Yeah, so we're talking about really building firewalls.
Yes.
This is
Yeah, it does
okay.
build a firewall between previous campaign committees and the one that's set up to participate in the public funding system.
All right.
Okay, Mr.
Going through the issues in the packet, the first issue, of course, is what's the fiscal impact of the bill? And that's why Mr. Hagedorn is here. We have the system has got a twofold system, essentially. The candidate collects qualifying contributions, puts them in their own campaign account that's set up just for this purpose, and then gets a receipt for each contribution. Then when they want to qualify, they send the receipts to the State Board of Elections, who will certify that somebody is qualified and that this is how much they're entitled to under your law. They then notify Mr. Hagedorn's office, the Department of Finance, who is in control of the money and actually makes the payments to the candidate's account. The question, though, is because, and obviously, this is going to require an appropriation from the council to get going. That's where the money, where's this money going to come from? Well, it's going to come from taxpayers' money. It's going to come from the taxpayers. The money that somebody ends up at the end of their campaign, when they're no longer a candidate, needs to be returned to the fund. So there might be some money coming back. The fund can accept voluntary contributions, but essentially what we're talking about is an appropriation in the county budget for this purpose. But don't forget, it's something that's going to be used every fourth year, except for in a case of special election. But the council obviously has the opportunity to put money in it each year, sort of like retiree health insurance benefits, putting money in advance for when you need it. The
May I add something on that? And I think it would be important, actually, for the council to appropriate money on an annual basis, because candidates who are thinking of participating will want to know that there is funding in the account to provide matching public funds. So if you want people to participate, the county will need to be able to demonstrate that the funding will be there, and it would make sense to do it on a gradual basis rather than, in the third or fourth year of a cycle.
Councilmember Reamer?
As well, though, I think it would be worth making the point that even if the money isn't sufficient in the appropriated fund, that there would still be ways for the council to draw from, reserve or something. I mean, the most responsible way to do it is to budget for it annually, but it's not the only way to do it. And if expenses, well, this gets to my bigger question, which is trying to estimate the actual fiscal impact. You've run scenarios that sort of loosely apply to the last couple elections. If the theory of the legislation is that it would result in more people running for office, then you have to wonder if any of the last elections are really the right precedent. The 2006 election, according to your estimate, could have been as much as 13 million. If we get another third more candidates, we're looking close to 20 million.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And I mean, all the numbers that we've seen is $10 million or $5.6 million. So I agree, the numbers can escalate pretty quickly.
I think we all have to
There are
kind of.
contested races. If there's no contested
Correct.
race, then there is no public
And it could
funding.
vary, well, we don't know if it'll vary widely. I mean, as an incumbent, my assumption is that it will encourage many people to get into the elections to run against incumbents, because it will be, reasonably possible for them to have the same amount of money as an incumbent would have. So I think you would see a lot of people getting in who today might not get in. So, I think that you'd get more candidates. I mean, I have to assume you get a lot more candidates under this system. I think we'll all have to kind of understand, what do we think are the number of people and the fiscal impact. And, at the end of the day, for me, this comes down to a couple of things, like how much of a problem do you think this is in the first place? Do you think our politics in our county are controlled by special interests or not?
Some people seem to think that.
Some people think they are. I don't think I am. But I wouldn't
I will
mind
state
not-
for the record, I am not.
Do you want to vote on that? or-
Absolutely not.
But, I understand that many people have this concern, and we all have to make our own judgment about that. It would be nice not to have to raise as much money for election. And sure, I would spend more time doing other things if I didn't have to raise as much money for an election. On the other hand, if it were $20 million, and that's a lot of teachers, that's a lot of cops, these are complicated questions.
We don't have an MOE for that, so I don't know. We'll have to think about it. One thing I wanted to point out, too, is that, we did appoint a right-to-vote task force, and so we do want to get also their take on this proposal, and I'm trying to keep a little list of some of the questions, I guess, that we would want to ask staff to also research for us. This issue also of best practices around the country would be really great, specific to the questions that we seem to be raising. So that way we can also have a little bit of a comparison. So anyway, I'm just kind of keeping a running list as we go. This is like a free-for-all right now in terms of whatever comes to your mind, let's just bring it up, because it is a very important, I think, goal. And obviously we want to get it right so that we can have the best possible participation, the best possible, the best possible result in terms of what it is that we're trying to solve. Okay. Anything else? Councilmember Rance.
Yeah, I understand your point. I understand Councilman Newman's point about whether this will have the unintended effect of requiring incumbents to raise more money. But I also.
I don't think that's what I meant, but.
Oh, well, that's what I was hearing. Well, let me just say this. I think that that the intent of this is to allow more people in the game, so to speak, right? So I think realistically, because there's a threshold you have to meet in order to get the matching funds, you're not going to get, I think that has to be considered as to how viable those people that are in the game are, in fact, right? And so I don't, so you may get a lot of people. Red is a good thing right now. So you may get a lot of people, but that would not necessarily require more effort on the part of the incumbent as far as fundraising is concerned.
Less, I think.
Exactly. And so I'm not sure that it would lower the overall amount of fundraising required. I think it would, in fact, shift the kind of fundraising that's being done.
From larger to smaller.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's the intent anyway. And I guess that has more than a little value. I'm still really kind of stuck on the slate issue. I really would like that examined considerably more, because it just seems, one way for unknown candidates to get in the game is through the slate process, and so the effect it would have. I think, I would just like to hear more about that in the upcoming.
Okay, I got it right here. Council Vice President Leventhal? You have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to stay, but I did overhear part of the conversation, and I just wanted to chime in. I think it is unfortunate to characterize the purpose of this bill as eliminating the threat of special interest influence, because I think it does run the risk of suggesting that any of us who are supporting this bill, which I'm strongly supporting this bill, think that we are unduly influenced by campaign contributions. That's not the reason for my support for this bill. As I said when I spoke at the press conference on this bill, I think it is an issue of time management. I'm very confident that for myself and for others who have credibility, who are known in the community, who have a record of achievement in the community, meeting the preliminary threshold is feasible and practical. And having met that preliminary threshold, the amount of time that I, as a candidate for office, must spend on the phone asking for money is a distraction from what I and my constituents would prefer that I do. Meet with constituents, research policy, think of new ideas to advance the public interest. So I'm not saying that the money that I raise affects our politics in a negative way in and of itself. What I think affects my capability to be a thorough and productive council member is the amount of time I must devote to raising money. And I think this bill substantially would reduce that for an office holder. I'm not afraid of being unduly influenced. I always have and always will act in what I believe is the public interest. And I don't believe that a change in where I raise my money from would change my perspective on public policy issues. What it would do is it would free up more time for me to do the reading and research and constituent meetings and community outreach, which I think people expect of their elected officials, but which we are unfortunately too often distracted from doing because we must devote so much of our time to raising money.
Very well stated, and I think that I think we have quite a bit of, let's just say, experience with that, track record on that, especially in light of the very bad recession and some of the decisions that this council had to make, that some people, I think that who would believe that we're just somehow influenced by special groups can see that this is a council that has always acted very independently. And so I do believe that there's quite a tradition here in Montgomery County of that, and I would definitely associate myself with Vice President Leventhal's comments. I look at it from that perspective as well, that if it allows us to spend less time in this tedious task of fundraising, then that would be wonderful. So anyway, so let's continue to work through. Councilmember Reamer and then Councilmember Andrews, sorry.
Well, Councilmember Branson just made a point which I thought kind of countervails, and I think we'll have to sit down and really look at it, which is you might have to spend just as much time because you're raising many, many more contributions from small donors. I don't know if that's true, or if that's what you meant to say. That's what I heard you say, Councilmember Branson.
I think that's a possibility that should
We'll have to just
be
look at it and
considered,
kind of
but-
all think about that. And then the other comment I wanted to make was, and it was a good comment from Mr. Leventhal. I mean, I appreciate that point. I think we also have to think about the consequence of having many well-funded candidates in every race, and what that might do to council members. Because this is my first re-election time, and I've seen everybody acting. We all anyway. There's an impact of having challengers, and under this regime, you would be guaranteed, I think, well-funded challengers for every race, and that's healthy. Perhaps.
Well, and I mean, I also think it's situational, and it depends. I mean, this notion of, doesn't mean that you're going to spend more time versus less time. When you're a first-time candidate, I mean, you're spending a lot of time getting your message out there, establishing the fact that you're credible, and that is time, no matter how you look at it, right? I mean, obviously, when you're an incumbent, hopefully you have a track record, and there's a lot more people that would be willing to step up and give you a small contribution. So I think no matter how you look at it, you will have to have that threshold of where you're going to have to establish your credibility and where you're going to have to establish a following and all of those things. And that's what we do. I mean, that's why it's called public office, I think. So I don't think that there's a shortcut so that this will become like, a total different type of experience. I think you still have to go out there and you still have to get your message out. But I think it does allow the point that I remember thinking resonated a lot with me, especially in those communities that don't traditionally participate too much in the political process, that if for a working mom, let's just say a single working mom, she says, well, this $25 is going to go a long way because I don't have the ability to give you $150. And so in that sense, I think it does empower folks who traditionally may not even give because they don't believe that, my tiny little amount is going to go anywhere. That's right. Councilmember Andrews and then Councilmember Leventhal.
Yeah, I agree with Councilmember Navarro. I think it will empower individuals to encourage them to participate in campaigns who might not in the past because they don't feel their small contribution by itself makes a difference or much of a difference. But with matching funds, it will speak louder. And that I do think it will create the possibility for more people who don't have access to traditional sources of big money to be able to run for office, and that's an important part of the bill, to expand the field. And it is really to the council's credit. It's striking that, because I do think it will result in more competition, that it speaks well of the council that all 9 incumbents, have signed on to the bill, because that probably is unusual in public financing systems around the country. It speaks really well of my colleagues that, they believe in the goals of this system. And are looking at it in a broad way.
Councilmember Leventhal.
As all my colleagues did, I'm sure, I read this bill and pondered how it would affect my candidacy. And I'm very familiar with how much money I have to raise and where it comes from. And I know that I have a very large number of contributors, hundreds and hundreds of people who I'm very fortunate have supported my campaigns, and most of those support my campaigns with small contributions. So in terms of the time, I am quite confident that given the length of time I've served this community, given the many, many friends that I've made, that my capability as someone with a broad base who represents all of Montgomery County and has friends in every part of the county, I would be able to meet the threshold requirement, and that it would not take the amount of strain on my schedule that the current requirement in a contested race against a self-funded candidate is. I am spending a lot of time raising money that under the parameters of this bill, my schedule would be quite different. I would be out hustling for votes. It's not like the time devoted to campaign activity would decline because I'm in a contested race and I still need to compete. But the specific amount of time, I think my constituents would prefer that I'm interacting with voters than that I'm on the phone raising money. And I'm very confident that the amount of time that would be necessary to meet the threshold requirement to get small donations at this point, with the length of time I've served, would not be as time-consuming. And then that gets to the question of, why is the threshold requirement there? Very much to prove that a candidate is bona fide and has a community base. What you don't want to do, and this would be the fear, is devote large amount of public dollars to candidates who don't have credibility and aren't respected and don't have a lot of support. But that's why you have the threshold requirement, which I think makes a great deal of sense.
Thank you, Mr. Demarinis. I just wanted to also just explain to you that one of the sort of collegial traditions on this council is that when we have a public hearing, we don't make a lot of comments because we save those for work sessions, which is why we're here now engaged fully in a conversation, because this is the time that we devote to that particular practice, yes.
Mr. Demarinis knows all about personal comments during work sessions from his time in Annapolis, so.
Wonderful, so you've been totally trained. Great, so let's see, Mr. Drummer.
All right, so getting back to fiscal impact, I just wanted to point out that.
Yeah, that's okay.
So, let me tell you what
I
this
think
bill
we've
is
gone for
about.
quite a bit already.
I just, the numbers that came out of finance are estimates of, based on the number of candidates from the last election, if everybody maxed out and everybody went for public funding, which may, is probably not likely to happen right away, at least, that, everybody in the race will go for public funding and everybody will hit the maximum, so just keep that in mind. But there's no, there's not an issue decision to be made here. It's just realize that this is going to cost money. It's going to cost real money, and it's going to be significant.
Well, just one
But-
quick point that I wanted to take, because I know that there is this notion here about the most responsible method of paying, to appropriate money for the fund annually, et cetera. And I think that was also another one of those questions for me in terms of what is done in other jurisdictions, because there were somebody brought up that point that, well, the council, what if it's the council that, because you're worried about these challengers, decides that for some reason, in a particular year, you just don't find the funds to appropriate to the particular NDA. It happens. I mean, we have a lot of other things.
I know,
to fund.
and I
And
guess.
so, that was brought up as one of those particular points. So what do you
This
say to that?
bill, as any bill, doesn't require an appropriation. I mean,
Right.
that comes in the budget.
Right.
That's separate. You'll do that in the budget. And if this bill is enacted, soon, in some form similar to this, then, you could start by putting money in the FY15 budget for this, some amount, to be determined, after you go through all the budget deliberations and figure out what everything else you're going to spend on. But, you could start right now. There's, and I guess there's a hope anyway that if what you say happens, then that would be worked out in the ballot box. I mean, that would become an election campaign issue. It's like, well, why didn't they put money in? Why did the incumbents not put any money in the fund? That could be,
So we're trying
maybe,
to
maybe
fund the
not. I mean,
libraries and the
there is no,
education,
there's no answer
the
to that.
class size and all that type of stuff. So I mean, it's just a reality, right? I mean, it's-
Right. I mean, and I'm not sure what the solution is,
Yeah.
because even if you put something in the bill that required you to appropriate X amount of dollars to this each year, that could be overridden in the budget anyway. The same 5 people that vote for the bill
votes.
could do that in the budget. So
Absolutely.
Could you not authorize some kind of, can't you authorize it to just pull from the reserve if there isn't enough money in the fund?
well, you could do a supplemental appropriation. I guess, you'd have to go back in if you're talking about the
You say like,
the rate stabilization fund, or the,
Yeah, and especially like.
I'm
with,
not sure you'd want to do
Right,
that.
the Revenue Stabilization Fund, that really can only be used if a budget becomes unfunded. So you cannot tap into it in order to fund the program. An existing budget has to become unfunded
I
during
guess
the
this is
year in order to
probably
tap-
not an issue, but it does seem like if there were a lot of uncertainty about whether there was going to be enough money, that would be, a problem, but.
And now, I don't want, we could jump to that issue now, because it seems to be coming up, but it's out of order, but that's fine. One of the questions that came up is, how do we handle a situation? Right now, the bill has a provision in it that says if there isn't enough money in the campaign fund, the election fund, public election fund, whatever it's called, to provide full matches, then the director is going to reduce everybody by the same percentage, which sounds fair and great, but in practice, if somebody goes out and the early qualifiers may get full funding and then the late qualifiers get 50 cents on the dollar or less, is one way to do it. I mean, first come, first serve. One suggestion that we have in the packet is that we have an assessment made by the Director of Finance at the beginning of the period as to whether there is enough money. If there's enough money in the fund, then they'll go ahead and pay 100%, give the full match. If they conclude, at whatever time period you say, that there isn't enough money, and the time period that we were recommending or suggesting would be sometime after the last budget decision is made before the qualifying period begins, so that you would know what's in the budget. Now, there could still be supplementals and whatnot, but you'd know what's already in the fund and what's been appropriated to be in the fund, and then people, at least the candidates, would know before they start if there's a question about whether they're going to get full matches or not. It's not a perfect result because it's going to be an estimate done by the Director of Finance. They're not going to be able to tell you absolutely for sure there's enough money in the fund because they don't know how many candidates are going to ultimately, run in each office. And they don't know how many candidates are going to max out. But they'll at least be able to do an assessment and an estimate like we do for many other things. And, I'm open to other suggestions, but that is a problem.
Right,
mean,
well,
is
no,
how to
I
handle
agree.
that.
I mean, I think as of July 1, you could say, this is how much money is in the bank, and this is how many claims can be put against that fund. But qualified contributions can continue to be made between July 1 and the end of October for a November 4th election, for example. And so during that time, we may be overshooting it. And what I mean is, like July 1, we may have perfect funding. By September, you may be underfunded. And how do you estimate it? Because we don't have any experience with it.
1 second, let me have Mr. DeMarinis answer that. And
Let me just say, on the state level, we do a first-come, first-served basis, at which point as more people then start to qualify, we reassess based upon the amount of money we have left, and then we start to say at a pro rata rate. I think that if you do it beforehand, that would put a lot of burden on an agency that's not necessarily involved in politics. You also get a lot of people that would maybe feel that it would have a chilling effect. All of a sudden, candidates are looking at it going, well, now they're playing politics with the matching fund, though it's not a dollar-for-dollar match. At one point here, you would want to deal with hard numbers, and if you said it in July of the preceding year, we would all know the dollar amount that's in there, and as candidates start to qualify, we can figure it out based upon, well, if they keep on giving us more and more returns, we would then have to start making sure that we would have enough funds for future matches throughout the year. I think doing it beforehand would bring an element to it that almost no other state or body has done. I think that you would have to almost let the process play out with a first-come, first-served basis. Otherwise, you would have candidates, I'm thinking about taking it, and then, never qualifying and, and being detrimental to the system.
sense. Councilmember Reamer, then Councilmember Branson.
Does the 1-year qualifying period work back from the November election, or is it? It's the primary, okay. And how would it handle with special elections? What would you do in special?
Well, the bill would cover special elections and would have the council set deadlines for qualifying periods for special elections. But there's no special provision on determining if there's going to be enough money in the fund. And special elections would drain the fund. If you have a special election, it's obviously going to use money in the fund. But on the other hand, when we have had, and we do have recent experience with special elections, they do cost money, and the council had to
Yeah, I remember
appropriate
that.
extra money for that, so it costs money, and if you have a special election, there'd have to be a little bit extra for this, too, I suppose. That's what you'd have to do.
Councilmember Branson.
You were talking about figuring out how much would be necessary to be in the fund. And, I guess my concern is because the fund is proposed to pay different match ratios depending on the category, doesn't that severely complicate your ability to determine at some set point in time whether there's going to be enough money in the fund? Because you really don't know how those contributions are going to come in. They could come in at a very differently than you may have anticipated. And since the lower amounts get the higher match, you could seriously underrate what it is you need to have in the fund. I mean, this is a big old algebra problem, isn't it?
Well, you know what the max somebody could get, and how many, what you don't know is how many candidates are going to put in for it, and how many of those candidates are going to hit the max. But if you assume they're all going to hit the max when you do your estimate, and I suppose that's what the
That's
finance
what you'd
would
have to
do.
assume.
They'd have to, or if they had some experience, maybe 20 years down the pike, they would have experience with this, and maybe they'd be able to do some different type of estimate, but probably
Right, no,
starting
I
out
agree.
with
And I think
probably
it's-
starting out with a max, and looking at the number of candidates that are, either announced or from the last election, and obviously, as Councilmember Remo pointed out, looking at the last election without a public financing system may not be the best estimate of an election with a public financing system, but that's only a problem the first time around. This is a bill that hopefully will last more than 4 years. It's a way to do the best you can. The point is not that we assume the Director of Finance would be always accurate in their estimates that would turn out to be true, because there are just estimates. It's that candidates, what the fear is that candidates would be not putting in for fear that there isn't going to be enough money. And if there is, if there's a statement by Director of Finance that, yes, it looks like we have enough money, our estimate is we have enough money, go get it, that's going to have one effect on the campaign. If Director of Finance in the beginning of the qualifying period says, I don't think we got enough money in here, then that's, I guess, a message to the executive and the council that maybe a supplemental appropriation is necessary. But it's also a message to candidates that, well, maybe I should think twice about doing this. But at least they would know beforehand. Not that a candidate could always start and withdraw. You could start collecting qualifying contributions, and before you even get certified, you could just withdraw and back away. Even after you get contributions, public funding, you can still withdraw, but you got to give the money back. So it's not like you can't ever get out of it once you're in it. You can.
So,
But-
yeah, go ahead.
So I don't know about giving the money back stuff. I mean, because really, there's not going to be any money to give back. I mean, they're going to spend them as a practical matter. But I guess what I'm wondering about is maybe there's a different timeline to draw, and because instead of a year out, maybe a timeline that takes into consideration when the filing deadline is, because the filing deadline is not a whole year out. And so at the point there's a filing deadline, then you have absolute certainty how many people you have in each and every race, right? And based on that certainty, then if there's a maximum, you can pretty much determine how much you'd end up spending. I'm not sure you could have that level of certainty a year out. Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, once the filing deadline, let's say, this year was February 25th. So on February 26th, the Director of Finance knows how many people are in the race. Finance may know how many people have already set up public campaign financing entities and have started soliciting qualifying contributions and could do a very accurate estimate. The question is that too late in the game to let people know if there's going to be enough money to match in order to get them to start with qualifying contributions? I don't know the answer to that. That's what you're kind of, you're playing against. Yeah, the later you go, the better your estimate, but the later you go, the less useful an accurate estimate is.
I guess what I'm hearing is that the state is doing it a little bit differently, right?
Yes, I mean,
Than what is proposed.
for the public financing portion of it, it goes back to March of the year before the election for eligible contributions. So our period is a little bit greater than the qualifying period that you have here. But yes, we're on a first-come, first-served basis. So we have right now 5 candidates that filed an intent for public financing. The public financing fund does not have enough monies in it to fully fund all 5 candidates for the primary election. But right now, we still are, but we only have 1 that actually qualified for it. We're still matching the qualifying funds $1 for $1 because the fund has enough in it to fully match that qualifying fund. As other candidates come into the system and qualify for the funds, we will reevaluate it as the time period goes in there. So I think that, in this situation here, you're going to you'll have candidates that would, if you want to look at your qualifying period and go off of the deadline for filing a certificate of candidacy, because you would have to, by that time, at least establish a candidate committee. You can go a year before that, because that's when we open up the filing period on that front. And when they file a certificate of candidacy, they have to make their intentions known whether or not they want to apply for it, at which point you would have a finite period as to this is when they would be ending as to the amount of money and the amount of candidates that would be, I would say, known to the finance committee, which would be on the filing, the certificate, the certificate of candidacy filing deadline. But that doesn't mean that they all will have qualifying funds at that point there. I mean, this is not something that you're going to go overnight and get, $40,000 in, $500 worth of qualifying funds. I mean, this is, it's not a, easy task. Everyone will be there. So yes, I mean, I think that on a first come, first served basis, at least everyone knows the rules of the game. And if they want to hold off and wait until the absolute deadline to file, well, that was a political decision that the candidate made, and recognizes the fact that, well, this is what we're doing it, and not necessarily on the administration aspect of it. Because if you do it beforehand and then everyone signs an intent, but then only one candidate qualifies and the other ones withdraw without necessarily taking any public funds, that's detrimental to the candidate that wishes to play by these rules.
Councilmember Anderson.
Thanks. So if I understand how the state system works, it's first come, first served until a point where it's determined that there would not be adequate funds, and then it's proportional?
Right, yes. So right now, it's first come, first serve, and then as we get more qualifying contributions as they come in, we start looking at it, and then we say, all right, now we have 3 qualifying candidates. Okay, at this point here, we have to then start looking at it, well, we still have the presumption that they will all max out. At that point there, we say, oh, now it's at 85 cents a dollar.
Yeah, I agree with your point. I think you make a very good point that you don't want to create a disincentive from the beginning of the process that someone might think that they're going to have a proportional reduction even though there is adequate funding at the beginning. So I think the state's approach is a logical way to do it, and you just then need to have a reasonable date at which point you determine whether there's likely to be enough funding in there or not, so that the legislative body has the time to, and would have the time, to make a supplemental appropriation if they determine to do so, in order to bring it up to what is thought to be the needed amount. And you will have, obviously, you have the best possible information by the filing deadline in terms of number of candidates, but you may not want to wait that long. The body, we might not want to wait that long. Council might not wait that long to make a supplemental appropriation. So, but it sounds like that's sort of the sequence that you want, is you provide first come, first serve funding, and you determine at some point in a timely fashion whether it's likely to be enough, and then the county council makes a decision about whether to pass a supplemental appropriation to make up the difference.
And the first come, first serve is, based on an estimate of what you think is a likely scenario of how much you need.
Well, it's first come, first served based on
I mean, the
candidate,
amount of funding
effect.
in
Yeah.
the first come, the amount of funding in the fund is just based on the estimate.
There's a certain amount. You're presuming there's a certain amount in the fund, and whichever candidate qualifies first begins to draw from it. And as more information becomes known about how many people are running, then you make a decision about how much more is likely to be needed and do a supplemental appropriation if necessary.
Okay, so why don't we have that particular item then
We're-
flushed out a little bit?
We're talking about issue 3
Talking about
now
issue
on the
3,
packet.
so if-
And there's,
I think there's interest in the committee to have delineated the state process so that we can compare it to your recommendations. So when we come back, we can make a decision of which, way, or if there's a hybrid that we'd like to pursue.
I think the way the bill is written is similar to the state process. If you look at lines 191 to 194 on Circle 9 is where the bill is, and it simply has a general, if the total amount of distribution is insufficient, director must reduce each public contribution to a candidate by the same percentage. There's no time frame set for a decision by the director. It's just simply whenever the director, so presumably up to that point, the director is going to be matching at a first come, first serve till the director finds that, wait a second, I think we don't have enough money.
Can I ask a question? On the next line, 195, it talks about that within 3 business days of the State Board of Elections authorizing a disbursement to be made. So, for example, what happens if we determine that the funds are insufficient to give a full matching as required in the law?
Well,
And we get an authorization from the Board of Election to disperse money. That's not a lot of time to come to the council and ask for additional appropriation and what have you.
Well, first of all, the 195 is that section is dealing with after the results of the primary, and the county board elections, who
okay.
wins, then the county board's going to tell us who won, certify candidates, and then what all that says is then you can continue giving matching funds to those people that are still on the ballot for the general election.
Isn't there a
There is
number of days
there is
that
a
we have-
provision elsewhere.
Okay.
I think somewhere it talks about a time period for
And that picture
turning
outline.
around the money. I think it's on, it's on line 213, 214. Director must deposit the appropriate public contribution into a participating candidate's
where it is,
play-
within 3 business
within
days.
3 business days after the board authorizes the public
Okay.
contribution.
So
I mean,
put the
that
wrong
would be
line with-
read in conjunction with 191 to 194, is if there isn't enough money in the fund, you're going to reduce it. If there's no money in the fund, you reduce the percentage down to 0. If there's less, but again, it's estimates, as to when. We could put in a simple first come, first serve, if they keep dispersing money at the full rate until there's no more money. That's certainly an option to use.
I have a question related to
Member
this.
Branson actually had a
Okay.
question, so before we.
Well, I don't really have a question. I just have sort of a cautionary statement. If the decision was made to pay out in a pro rata way after a certain point in time, I think that would be probably a very bad decision. And the reason I say that is because politically, if I'm the challenger, I'm going to say you're trying to choke me off, and it's going to be the situation will be set up so it will be the same people who are in the contest who will be making the decision about how much money gets in the fund, and I think that would just add a very ugly element that's not necessary, and so I would really just want to say that pro rata distribution, especially given that this is the same body that would have to okay the funds, is really a bad idea. But I won't be here, so y'all can do what you want.
I had another question too about disbursement. So what is in there? I see that on line 126, basically, no, that's not the right line. Well, I'm trying to find out how the candidate, what are the requirements for payment to the candidate? Is it a weekly disbursement? Is it daily disbursement? How often can the candidates, it looks like they can submit any contribution at any time.
Yeah, I mean, they can submit contributions on a, hourly basis, I guess, to the state board, but the state board's not going to get back to you right away. I mean, the state board's going to, well, go ahead.
I was gonna, we wouldn't take it on an hourly basis. At best, what I was going to, I have that as one of my notes too, the time period for requesting public funds. We have right now a 2-week period, so that it's on the first and third Tuesdays of every month that they can request public funds on the gubernatorial cycle there. I would suggest something along those lines there for administrative purposes. I think that if you wait over, we used to do it on a monthly basis in 1994. It's the only example that we have in this in the state, but that would play a little bit too long in the campaign season, especially in the truncated season that we're in now. I think that a 2-week period would be an ample enough time for all administrative purposes, because we would have to take we would have to get the report into us. We would have to verify that all these individuals that live in your district gave under $150. So there's a process to actually making sure that it goes through the correct procedures. At which point then I would have to notify the county to tell them that this is the dollar figure to deposit in the account. So I think a 2-week period for reports would be administratively possible. I think anything earlier than that, or like a weekly basis, would not be. One, you wouldn't have enough sufficient amount of funds to do it, and two, it would just be, the state also does have to deal with the regular campaign finance life of the rest of the state. So,
And are these Are these staff functions provided by the state or by the county? I thought it was provided by the county Board of Elections.
It would probably be by it would be by the state, but probably billed, for these functionalities, might be even billed back to the county.
Would it be acceptable to actually administer it out of the county? I mean, it'd be a big difference for candidates not to have to drive to Annapolis, but to drive to Rockville and process those kind of things.
Well, it's all electronic.
It's all electronic.
Right, so I mean, you don't come to Annapolis to
okay.
file your reports currently. The idea is that the state has the infrastructure right now to handle this. We have the portal, we have the website, we have the software. We have also been the exclusive campaign finance, I'd say, administration body and governing body since 2005. So you're talking about, by the time this even gets implemented, well over a decade that, the state would be there. For a county to do this, they would have to develop their own.
Sorry, I just misunderstood what the nature of the process was. So it's
Right.
electronic. I mean, you're still
Right.
depositing your checks into your own bank account, and you're just reporting them to the state as contributions to your campaign
Right.
account.
I mean, right now, if they have electronic deposits, we would just say to them, we would give them a letter saying, candidate X, gave us 200 contributions. We verified this is the dollar amount, and please deposit this into this person's account. Because we would have their bank account information at one point as well.
And I guess, and that would be the point, that we have to make sure that there is sufficient funds. And if there is not sufficient funding, we have to prorate it. And that's where the 3 days comes in. So if they tell us on Tuesday, we would make the payment on Friday. And so if the council wanted to have additional appropriation, I don't know how the mechanics of that would work, considering that the law says we have 3 days to make the payment. So that's the only issue that I
You have
want to
3 days to make the payment or prorate it if there's not enough money in there. Reduce the payment by, as long as you're reducing the payments to everybody equally. You couldn't pick one candidate and say, well, I'm giving you 75% and I'm giving the next guy 50%.
Right.
Everybody gets 75 cents on the dollar or 50, whatever you decide is you've got. The council then could come back, even if they don't do it, it's not going to happen in 3 days. But, and do a supplemental appropriation to the fund, and then you could go back and say, all right, everybody got 75 cents on the dollar, now here's the other 25 cents. I mean, you could do that theoretically. That's not optimum. Optimum is to have enough money in the fund in the first place. And so that this is not a question. I guess, as Councilmember Branson pointed out, it may be, a better time to make an announcement as to whether there's enough money in the fund is, this year would have been February 25th, when we know how many of the candidates there are, and maybe that's enough time. I mean, as I said, you can start collecting qualifying contributions, once you've filed your intent, but you can't really file your intent until you've filed your candidacy. I mean, you have to file your candidacy too. So, if people are generally waiting till the end of, right before the deadline for filing candidacy, then maybe that's not such a bad time to let people know if there's public funding available.
Okay, quick, Rand.
I have Councilmember Andrews, and then I want to do a time check. I think I just want to do another 5 minutes. And then we'll, Mr. Drummer and Mr. Hamlin, there are a list of outstanding questions that we'd like to answer. And then obviously we'll have to finish some of the points in the packet in our next work session. But I think this has been a very robust conversation, lots of different pieces to consider and work out. Councilmember Andrews.
Thank you. So I heard Mr. Mayor say that you think that you need about a 2-week turnaround time when a candidate submitted their request, in effect, for eligible public funds. And you have a first and third Tuesday, you said, currently for the gubernatorial candidates who are qualifying for that. Do you see a reason, so I hear the 2-week turnaround you need. Do you see a reason, though, why the request couldn't be submitted on a weekly basis so that you still have the 2-week turnaround, but that you have a period where the candidate may not have to wait 2 weeks to submit. So having a more frequent opportunity to request funds, even though the turnaround time remains the same.
I mean, I mean, if you just want to have the reports come in weekly, I mean, I just don't want to put us on a schedule there. And I think that when you have the reports come in, I would almost assume that there would be an expectation from the candidates to have that funds be processed. If I'm going to wait the 2 weeks to look at 2 reports to start processing it, I guess my thing would be, would it be, the expectation factor there? I mean, if, I look at it and go, well, depending on how many candidates and everything, that it would be almost, I guess, I don't want to create an expectation of a weekly turnaround.
Right.
Especially the first time. Now, if this is something where we look at it and go, oh, yes, we can do this in a week, or, in 4 years from now, technology allows us to integrate more features between the two. Yes, I mean, because it's basically trying to, making sure that everyone's in the district and matching that up there. I just don't want to commit to something and saying that we can do it on a weekly basis and then get into trouble, rather than saying, I know we can do this probably on a 2-week basis, and not create that expectation among the candidates as they follow their reports as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, I hear you in terms of
I
concern about creating expectation, although it could still be made clear that there's a 2-week turnaround time, but that you
Right.
can submit it on a weekly
Okay.
basis, so that the candidate's not holding it for 10 days. Rather, they're not collecting necessarily a larger amount over. They probably have a larger amount to submit over a 2-week period than a 1-week period, and that they're at least getting it going earlier in the 2 weeks. The 2-week process starts potentially sooner.
Right.
And spreads the work out a little more evenly as well, potentially, for the state board.
It
Oh,
could.
just a thought.
I just want to recommend one point here too. Just dealing with treasurers, it is a voluntary thing. You are putting burdens on them as well. That these are your treasurers. These are the people that they would be typing in these reports, submitting these documents, and if they don't submit them, and if we have it on a weekly basis for this, if they fail to make it on that on say every Tuesday of a month, would there be a penalty if they missed it, or if there's not, they just skip off to the next one then? So I mean, just take a look at your own treasurers, and you might want to ask them if you're interested in doing this, would you like to do a report weekly, or so
Yeah.
I will say that we're talking about something that right now in the bill would be covered in the regulations.
Yeah. Okay.
It's not something that
Sure.
has to be in, it could be, but it doesn't have to be in the bill.
I think it's
It's
important
how-
for
I
us
mean,
to have a clear, robust understanding of all of those details, but you're absolutely right.
And the other thing, I
Councilmember-
wanted to react, Councilmember Branstad brought up the issue earlier of slates, and there are 2 potential approaches there, it seems. The bill, as drafted, doesn't prohibit participation in a slate as long as all the other members of the slate are also participating in the public financing system. I wanted to ask Mr. Maris if that is something that he thinks would pass muster with the state board, or whether there needs to be, in your judgment, under whatever framework there is under the state law, that slates are not allowed or not, period. So do you think a requirement in this bill that if you're going to be on a slate, you can only be on the slate if all members are participating in the public financing system is consistent with the state law and the interpretation of it by the state board, or not?
I think that you're fine with the restrictions on that front. I think that the one issue that you might have a problem with is that if it's a slate, then are you allowing them to share and pool resources for this election? So if you have, say, an at-large with a district, are they going to pull the $250,000 and $125,000 together and then make expenses on that? And then, right now, this, the state law does not, I guess, monitor on how the slate makes its expenses. So if you slate up, even with publicly financed candidates together, you could have an unequal distribution of public monies going to, say, one candidate in a more competitive election rather than a public finance candidate in in an uncontested election. So you may not want to have even the ability for any of them to slate up, just because then they can say, well, this is my money, and if I want to join a piece together, say all the county council members, they would each then share the costs of that piece and then itemize it accordingly.
Okay.
So just,
Another issue to chew over.
yes.
Councilmember Reamer had his line out first, and then.
Well, one more quick comment on the slate. My reading of the law so far is that candidates could raise money for a slate that are otherwise banned for their qualification to the public finance system. Because the determination was you could only be in a slate if everyone on the slate is also in the public finance system, but it did not prohibit you from raising those funds to the slate that you are not allowed to raise to your individual campaign. So maybe that's an oversight, or maybe, is that an oversight, or is that something we can't prevent?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, if you're
The
not allowed to
situation
accept
you're
PAC
talking about.
contributions if if you participate in the system, but you could form a slate with three other candidates who are in the system and then raise PAC contributions into that slate account, couldn't you?
I see that.
I don't think so.
I see what he's referring to, which is, I think, on line 244 and 245 and 246. It mentions including a political action committee and state and local central committees, but I guess the term would be, any political committee in that situation.
I just want to make the point, I think the objective is that if you are in a slate with other candidates in the public finance system, that the slate is subject to the same limitations that the public finance system has.
Yes.
Well, the point is, if each candidate in the slate is subject to not accepting contributions from a PAC because they're all in the public financing system, then how would the slate be able to take a contribution from a PAC? My mind, that it's covered, but maybe not.
It's possible I don't understand how slates work well enough. I've never been in a slate, or it's not something I've ever been involved in.
So can we put that on the list of those things that we need more information about? I already noted that. I'm going to turn to Councilmember Branson, and then we
Yeah,
need to wrap it up.
and just, sorry, one more question about the slate. It's the pesky First Amendment, because I think that if the law says that I have to be, that it essentially ties me to this group of people, which maybe I want to be, maybe I don't, but assume that I do, at that point, my ability to take funds from others sort of ceases, because I've consented to be in this group that is a public financing group. Had I not consented to that, then I could still raise other money, right? In a different account. So no. Here's my ultimate concern: whether or not the requirement of the slate as a group is somehow potentially adversely affecting my freedom of association as opposed to my freedom of speech. So because it's tying me to this group, and if you could think on that and get back to me.
Okay. That's fair. Okay, so So a couple of things. So we're definitely going to also approach the right to vote task force on some of these issues, just to get their overall thinking. I believe earlier there was a request for an Excel spreadsheet just to look at the scenarios and some possibilities, just to have an overall idea. I think overarching, I think it's the issue of best practices, and we have the state already who's doing this, and I think it's great to compare it to what they're doing, and then perhaps what other jurisdictions are doing. I think that would be really useful. I know Council President Rice had brought up the issue of the threshold, what constitutes coordination, with independent groups, et cetera. So I think that's probably going to come up again. And, what would be the threshold that would determine the scheme to evade? I mean, I think that's probably something people would like to know. Also, obviously, the issue of appropriation and how can we best, I know it's going to be tough to have a perfect solution, but the issue of, how do we determine if there's enough money in the fund? Do we want to do the prorated? Do we want to just go ahead and follow what the state is doing? But just generally, how can we best coalesce around a practice around that area, around this issue of enough funds and not then dissuade somebody to want to participate. And then around the best practice issue, this notion of the 2-week distribution cycle, I guess, if we're going to be tied to the state process, that's probably going to be important to be aligned, but obviously would be something else that we can look at. And then obviously we have some other outstanding issues that we didn't go through, so I think we should have another really great session that we can dive into all these issues, and hopefully Mr. Demarinis will be available to come back and visit with us again. And somebody from finance, Mr. Beecher and Mr. Dorn, which it's been great to have you here today.